This is a chapter from my upcoming autobiography. "250 to 290 days a year on the road, touring all over America and Canada, touring Europe and the United Kingdom. That was the state of things for me and my wife, Stacy. In the late 1990s through the early 2000s. Even when we fell off from that pace, it would still be 200 to 225 days a year. That would be our life for 14 or 15 years. She did a bit of solo touring at the front end of that period, and I would tour solo some also. By early 2013, she was no longer doing grueling tour runs, but I did keep it up. At time of writing, I am still at it, 2021, though the year of 2020 was mostly lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Remember rocker Robbie Robertson in the Last Waltz movie saying, "The numbers start to scare you"? He was referring to 15 years on the road. I am now in the 42 years range of playing music professionally, nearly that much doing road work. I laugh now at Robbie making a big deal out of 15 years. We were about to take a four-piece band on tour in 2000 to promote Stacy's sophomore CD, Dancing With Them That Brung Me. After that, we would officially bill as a duo. Our touring vehicle had been a Chevy Astro van without four-wheel drive. That had cost us a few times, having only front-wheel drive. So we knew a larger vehicle was needed for four persons and all the instruments, luggage, merch. We knew four-wheel drive was a smart thing to have. We purchased a 1999 black Chevy Suburban, an SUV. Some of the folkies on our circuit gave us a hard time about having a gas-guzzling vehicle. I'm not sure how they thought we were to make it to our shows every night with all the bodies and gear. On a moped, maybe. Anyway, the 2000 year of Suburban was on the lot. We had never owned a brand new vehicle before. Our upswing in the music career was enough that we felt we could make the leap and afford it. However, there was one lone 1998 Suburban on the lot, never owned, and had 17 test miles on it. We were offered a $5,000 less price if we took it, so we did. When we sold it in the year 2016 or so, it had 529,000 miles on the original unoverhauled engine. I was in Michigan year 2011 or so doing a solo run of concert dates, and the Chevy had about 442,000 miles on it. The engine had never been worked on, and it seemed like an amazement that could happen. I was on stage and talking between songs. I brought it up to the audience that the Chevy had achieved so many miles. I mentioned that the transmission had gone 359,000 miles before it had been overhauled. That was possibly even more incredible. At the end of the show, some fellows walked up and asked if I was indeed driving the vehicle on that very tour. I assured them that I was and reminded them that I had mentioned it was parked in front of the venue. They insisted on seeing it, and I packed my guitars and cables, got paid, and met them in the dark parking lot. My assumption was that they believed I had lied about the numbers. So I opened the driver's side door and stepped back. I thought they would lean in to see the odometer, which would have shown 442,000 plus miles. However, they knelt and started looking at the door. They were looking for the VIN number and found it. It turned out that 2 of the guys had built the vehicle. All 4 of them had been auto workers, and 2 were recently laid off, 2 recently retired. They could decipher the VIN number and knew which factory, which day, etc. it was made. 2 of these gentlemen had built my Suburban, and here we were 442,000 miles later. Of course, it was born in Michigan, and there I was. Now began a countdown to 500,000 miles. Stacy would post the update on the internet daily, and we put number magnets on the back. People behind us on the highway could see where the odometer stood on a given day. It became a bit of a game following Stacy Earle and Mark Stewart to see the miles click upward. At home and between runs, I was planning our next long tour run and did the math. I had a solid prediction of where we would be when the number rolled over to 500,000. My best guess had us in Michigan for it. Again, the romance of it all, hitting the milestone where she had been born. We left our Tennessee home for weeks of concert dates to play, and there were about 2 weeks until the 500,000 occasion would occur. As it turns out, the show in Clarkston, a suburb of Detroit, was where the much-followed event would take place. We were performing at a house concert, and the hosts were friends who had presented us before. As we rolled into their driveway, the odometer was 499,998. The host couple climbed into the vehicle with us, and I drove around the neighborhood to drive off the last 2 miles. As we crept into their driveway for the moment, the sound man came out and leaned in to film it all. We watched it roll over to 500,000 miles and were joyful. I believe my back and hips can attest to that 500,000. That is a lot to do in one individual automobile. It all happened in about 11 and a half years. Folks everywhere seem to think that we should contact General Motors / Chevrolet and ask for some sort of sponsorship or nod to the achievement. Stacy chased after that, and we were sent a free oil change. I'm serious. A free oil change. After lots of brain crunching over the matter, I have concluded that we would have been better off to ask the company for some sponsorship for being quiet about it. I believe they do not want people knowing that a vehicle will do 500,000 miles on an original engine. They would rather keep selling us new cars every few years. It was a blessing to fly to Europe and tour every year because I could enjoy not driving a vehicle for a while. Our duo would go to the continent and the UK and Ireland every year for a while. Sometimes we were there twice a year. The tours were always lengthy for that leg because it was expensive to get there and back home. We would be across the pond for 8 weeks minimal and 11 weeks at times. Our income would swell from the long, heavy stint because we played nearly every night. Our profile was bigger in those markets, meaning the press coverage was elevated, the tickets were higher in price, the merch was sold at a larger clip, etc. We did lots of BBC radio interviews and performance spots, and TV in Spain. We had been on TV in the USA a small amount and more in Canada. However, the other side of the water was a noticeable higher plateau for us. As well as hard-traveling artists, such as our status was in the States, we were more stars in the UK and parts of Europe. Our travel was often somewhat brutal there, as we did so many shows in such a small span. We did most of it by train. That is unthinkable in North America, to go from city to city every day via train and make the show on time. Sometimes we had to do 2 or 3 trains to get to our destination. However, it was possible. It could be enjoyable to put the guitars in an overhead bin, pull the luggage near us, and sit to watch the scenery while traveling. I could eat a sandwich, read, or sleep. All promoters arranged for PA and lights, and that allowed us to take one acoustic guitar for the entire tour. One acoustic guitar each for the entire tour. However, there were times that we realized not having a car for ourselves was crippling. There was a show of ours that was housed in a mansion in the country. This concert was in the UK. A presenter had brought us in for this year, the year before, so it was our second time to play the magnificent old house. The size of it was unbelievable, nearly an old castle. The plan was for us to catch 3 trains that day, a taxi for 20 miles, and sleep in the mansion after the concert. After a laboring day of trains, humping the guitars and luggage on and off train cars, we hired a taxi to make a long drive to the performance site. Because we had a show the next night far from this one and would need to reverse the travel arrangement essentially, we hired the same driver to pick us up the following morning. It would be an excruciatingly early time in the morning to get started. He was booked for it and promised to be there, I think at 5:30 a.m. We had no telephone in the mansion and no neighbors. The owners were to be there, though. We found upon arrival that they had an ugly quarrel the day of our show. Each had left the premises and flown to another country to sulk. Once the audience, presenter, and sound person left the mansion, we were on our own. It was extremely late at night, and the massive building was devoid of persons, aside from us. There was no other home within 10 or 15 miles, I believe. The gigantic front door was our only entrance and exit. We were to lock it upon leaving, and if we were outside after the locking, there would be no way to re-enter. Our bedroom was as big as a house. There was a bathtub that sat inside it 30 feet away from our bed. The taxi driver was our only hope of leaving in the morning, and we could only pray that he would turn up at 5:30. I cannot express how spooky it was in that massive ancient place. Stacy was terrifically scared to be there, and I had to do my best to console her as well as sleep a few hours. The next day would be a rough one. Fortunately, we got all our belongings outside after the driver arrived, closed the front door, and were on our way. There were 20 miles in the cab to get to the small town train platform. We were so relieved to get away with no foul-ups of any kind. In a rare use of train in the USA, our duo of Stacy Earle and Mark Stewart would ride for a short trip from Tarrytown, just outside New York City, into the Big Apple. The circumstance was 6 days after 9/11. We were on many weeks of tour dates when the terrorist attack of September 11th, 2001 occurred. I had been taking a shower in Guelph, Ontario, and Stacy pulled the curtain back to tell me what was happening. We were checking out of a hotel and going to drive across Toronto to a show in tiny Brooklyn, Ontario. Guelph had been our September 10th concert, and it was a typical day of gathering our things and driving to the new town. The drive should have been 2 hours, an easy day. But while all the planes were in the air and little known about how many were being made into missiles, it was decided to evacuate around all tall structures. The CN Tower in Toronto was such a concern. So our drive became 7 hours as we circumnavigated the hugely populated city while fighting off all the exodus of cars. Everyone at the house concert that night was in a weird state of mind, as were we. There were some 50 people there in close quarters, and the show was about to begin when a fellow walked up to me. He said that he had graduated from seminary school that very day and wanted to have a prayer over our microphone. I said okay to that. He mentioned that there were a lot of horrible things happening to our friends to the south, and it hit me that the audience, all Canadian, saw it more as happening to someone else than to themselves. My feeling at that moment was that my country was under a challenging time and that we were removed from all our loved ones. The Canadians would take on countless aircraft that had to make emergency landings to get out of the sky. Our fear was that we could not re-enter the U.S. for an unpredictable period. They shut the border down. There were a few shows left to play before a Boston date, and that would be the day of crossing the border into Vermont. Would we make our Boston show? Would we be trapped outside the U.S. for months? We did not know for a few days. On the day of the Boston concert, the border closing was reversed, and we made it with no trouble. In those days, the audiences fell off. People were afraid and in a strange frenzy. We performed in Washington, D.C., technically Arlington, Virginia, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Those were near the site of two of the crash sites. Then our schedule had us in New York City, the other locale of two crash sites. The area in Manhattan where our venue was located was being treated completely as a war zone. The talk was that everything was shut down, including our little concert venue. Our concert would likely be canceled, and we would have to stay out of the city with no earnings. However, on the day of the show, we found out that they were allowing limited people in to do some things. Our show was going to take place after all, but most of the audience would be unable to get clearance to attend. Would we perform if most of the audience were volunteers working at Ground Zero, clearing the rubble from the World Trade Centers? The promoter asked us about it. We had a guarantee of money versus a chance for more, based on attendance. I will always regret this. I insisted that we would do it for half of our guarantee, but not for free. My reasoning was that shows were having small turnouts now as a result of 9/11, and we were taking a financial hit. Our hotel and fuel and food expenses were not less. So our monies were getting tighter. Two venues had already insisted we take less than our guarantee. Half pay seemed like a gesture on our part, but if I could do it over, I would take no money for that night. We could not take our vehicle to the venue. We caught a train in Tarrytown, taking the bare minimal gear with us. The train dumped us into a place where we grabbed a taxi. The taxi dropped us at a checkpoint where there were soldiers with weaponry all around us. We placed the guitar cases on the sidewalk and opened them at the demand of the soldiers. I had a contract for the show in hand, and we explained that we were going in to play an intimate acoustic concert, mostly for Ground Zero workers. After a little deliberation, the soldiers allowed us to continue. However, at this point, our journey would have to be by foot. We had blocks to walk with guitar cases and a bag of cables and tuners and such. After we rounded a corner, a sight and sound that I cannot forget or properly explain came about. We were in Manhattan, and there were no people. There were no hustling and bustling people all over the sidewalks. There were no cabs, no automobiles at all. As we got further from the place where the soldiers had checked our gear, it became noticeable that we could hear our footsteps echoing off the skyscraper buildings. The roads and sidewalks were covered with all of that soot that we had seen on TV rolling down the streets after the towers collapsed. The windows high above us were cracked and covered with that same powdered stuff. We felt like we were inside a sci-fi film, a futuristic place of dread. The sound check went okay, and there was some time before the audience showed. The sound man told us to take the time to walk a couple more blocks, and we would get to 4 blocks from Ground Zero. He said we should not miss the opportunity to see such a memorable scene, though it was so tragic. So we walked down to it. We could see the rubble with our naked eye, and the fire had not been put out. It was still coming out of the top of the pile of concrete and steel. From our standing, we could not have gone a step closer, or we would have been shot. This was the closest any regular citizen was to go. During this concert, the crowd members were very haggard in appearance and had scowls and dejection on their faces. They were all workers in the middle of an awful scenario. There was no joy in them. At the end, some of them came up to us to talk. Stacy is very bubbly and sunshiny in performance. I'm more stoic. They said, "Thank you for giving us the first smile we have had in 6 days." I did not notice anyone had smiled, but if smile they did, I am so glad of it. They could have felt a smile while not outwardly showing it. Times were not positive that night. We walked back to the checkpoint to call a cab. We saw one large truck carry one large beam away from the rubble site. Stacy said it was going to take a long, long time to clear it all away. One beam at a time.